Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to my talk at Black Hat Asia 2021. I'm very excited to be back here as a member of the review board and also as a member of the InfoSec community. I am presenting today a talk called Vibe Check. I don't know about this. Why students may shy away from cyber in a surveillance state. First, a bit about me. My name is Mika Devonshire. I'm an incident responder and cybercrime investigator by day, I like to say, and was an assistant professor of malware by night. I have spent about a decade in the information security space in everything from defense, so blue team, network defense, vulnerability management, and operations, to a bit of offensive security and systems engineering. I've also participated on different kinds of research groups and capture the flag hacking training groups outside of work. And in addition, also enjoy connecting and networking with females in cybersecurity through a lot of these different means. Here are some ways to stay in touch with me if you want to talk more after this, either on LinkedIn or Twitter. And of course, I'll stick around after this presentation to talk to you all and hopefully hear some questions and engage with you on this very topic. I do have to say at the gate that I'm not a lawyer, and nothing in this talk should be misconstrued as legal advice or anything that can be considered advice by a lawyer, because I'm not qualified or trained as such. In terms of my qualifications, I've done a lot of the training and certifications that many of us go through in this field. I have my GCFA, CISP, Certified Ethical Hacker, Network Plus, Security Plus, and some of those other ones. It's just a quick way of saying that I've spent a lot of time in this field and truly enjoy and am passionate about information security. So what started this talk? Why are we here today, and why are we talking about education in the Asia Pacific region and what the implications of a security state might be on that? The origin of this story is basically fall of 2019, when I was an assistant professor of malware analysis on Hong Kong University campus. I thoroughly enjoyed my time there. We were teaching about system internals, Windows internals, memory analysis, code analysis, both static and dynamic, where you get to interact with students who are detonating their first piece of malware, setting up their first sandbox, and also really understanding the connection between program execution and actions on objectives. So what happens after you've trained and taught someone what to look for in an environment? That's what we forensic investigators do. This class kind of gives you all that foundation as to how malware really works and what to look for in terms of system artifacts. That said, the climate on Hong Kong University's campus in the fall of 2019 was a bit different than you're probably used to on a standard university campus. I can only present as an outsider who had the privilege and opportunity to teach on campus that I felt very humbled by the campus environment. I was able to also talk with some of my students before and after our semester, and got to thinking about how that would impact anyone's education, and that pivotal time in your life where you're trying to develop your career path, you're trying to understand, how you will enter the workforce and what you'll be looking to do moving forward. So I got to speaking with some of my old students and collected some testimonials, because the topic of information security is very much so tied to data privacy and data security. And of course, we talk about there being a lot of surveillance around the area, and just in hearing some of their responses to my questions, it really did seem like surveillance was influencing whether or not they would choose to pursue information security as a profession, and particularly whether they would continue with malware investigation after the semester. All in all, the main outcome of that was that there weren't as many students interested in it as I wanted. I couldn't hire any of these bright young individuals to join my company, of course, and I really wanted to dive into why that was. So the purpose of this talk is to kind of communicate some of those findings and also expand on what I found across the Asia Pacific region with some other use cases or case studies and stories just about why students do or do not enter the hacking space, why they choose to pursue safer careers, and how we're going to fill this skills gap and this job shortage that some estimates put as high as 4 million jobs worldwide that we can't fill due to the lack of trained and skilled information security practitioners. So let's talk about that for a bit and discuss why this problem needs to be solved and what we can do about it. So this talk will primarily put some color to why I think these students aren't eager to enter the field, and clarify some of the reasons why that should be changing moving forward. So one student's testimonial simply said in plain text that there's not enough interest to pursue cybersecurity professionally. I think that comes up a lot of times when you're speaking with analysts or penetration testers that kind of see it as a stagnating field, that, you could spend a lot of time training and getting certified and qualified for all of this, but they're just not interested in moving it forward because other jobs might be more prestigious and whatnot. This is the main point that I want to try to upend with this talk, is that there's not enough interest to pursue cybersecurity professionally, whereas I will argue that there is. Reason number one that I heard from a lot of these testimonials, and that I find across all the literature, is that they're afraid. They're afraid of the consequences of joining the field, and they believe that if they're involved in any kind of illicit or even gray area behavior, which is what it takes to become an ethical hacker and to gain those skills in order to be able to access networks or exploit vulnerabilities and show proofs of concept that these vulnerabilities are exploitable, they're just afraid of being involved in that at all due to political circumstances that we'll talk about in a second. Second is a lack of interest. So students are not really seeing this as a career path that will sustain them for a long time. It may seem niche or interesting for a period of time, but not long enough. And they genuinely are more intrigued by things like AI or data science or coding or development if they have any technical skills at all. And then third, lack of prestige. So some students find that they're not going to be as revered or admired for entering a field like ethical hacking, where they could be at a bank, in IT administration, or architecting large networks, and have what they believe a more prestigious role. So to touch on sort of the backbone that draws all these together, especially in the vein of fear, is that idea of what is a surveillance state. Surveillance refers to the way that an area is designed, or a country is designed, or a security apparatus is designed to minimize the risk of crime. So you want to reduce the crime rate by increasing the amount of watchful eyes. You want to encourage good behavior by letting people know that their behavior is being observed and that there are consequences on bad behavior. So how this manifests in a lot of countries is that there are zero tolerance policies. So first strike offense means grave or serious consequences. It could be in terms of fines or jail time or things of that nature. But there really are some harsh penalties for breaking the laws, as many of us know. Another way that surveillance is deployed is through closed-circuit television cameras. So across the Asia-Pacific region, there are a lot of, and everywhere really, there are smart cameras that can not only monitor for movement and behavior and facial recognition, there's also image recognition, and then there are large backend databases and things like that. But closed-circuit television, another one of these watchtowers that's observed. Lighting on streets is a simple way to kind of show what's happening in a given region. And then, of course, the one at the bottom is the one that most students who are afraid of ethical hacking will state as being their primary concern, which is, what is being monitored by the ISP and how is their activity online being traced and followed. If you are to participate in a capture the flag competition, or you're looking to participate in Hack the Box or Pwn to Own or any of these competitions, is that seen as a negative? And if you're just trying to research ways of breaking into different places, or exploiting SMB vulnerabilities, or cracking SSH passwords with weak ciphers. All of this all has to do with that fear, and if you can't overcome that fear of being monitored, surveilled, you wouldn't enter the field. So that kind of paints the picture. And as we look at this graph, the number of countries just on this top 10 list that are over in Asia Pacific include China, Singapore, Australia, Hong Kong, and India. Obviously very large populations, but you think about Singapore having very strict rules, the Philippines also having very strict rules against criminal activity. There are many places in the world that kind of pair that surveillance with that increased zero tolerance for punishment policy. So on the first reason, fear, again, just going back to being in Hong Kong and kind of understanding that there was a lot going on and not really understanding exactly where and when activities were taking place, I knew that at a certain point I could pull back and find some source of information, just given the number of security cameras and surveillance footage that was around. So this is a screenshot from my work computer. One day I found a feed that was able to pull feeds from traffic cameras, news stations, even people live streaming from their phones to different social media networks. This one website would pull all of those images together and sort of live stream to you what was happening and give you situational awareness where otherwise there really was none. Because what's reported on television may show one view of activity, and then you can kind of triangulate that with everything else that's happening. So when you think about that, surveillance really does give you that holistic view of what's happening from all angles, and you can enrich that data with intelligence and try to understand more about that. But why would that be discouraging? If you are curious about internet security and curious about weak internet protocols, it makes sense that you would want to explore that more. Well, what came very clear from the testimonial provided by students was that there is not a great amount of legal education that helps inform which activities are strictly prohibited and which activities are permitted under law. So it's very hard, in the student's opinion, to judge what is prohibited and what's not. That said, there are some common ways that we can try to overcome this and help bring a little bit more clarification to those students as to what is and is not legal. So how can we clarify the student's question as to what is prohibited and what is allowed under law? The greatest place to start is by looking to the country codes themselves and getting familiar with what the rules strictly state is prohibited. So knowing the rules is the first step in really getting comfortable with what is and is not good behavior. And a lot of this is intuitive, knowing when you're doing something for the purpose of education or for the purpose of harm. It will become clear over time, but I hope that most people will be familiar with at least some of these acts and statutes that govern our online behavior. So just a few from the APAC region and one from the US that can be looked at, read here and there. They all share very similar core tenets, which basically discuss, what is a computer system, right? They'll always start with the definition of that. And in this day and age, it's really anything that can process data and is or is not sometimes connected to the internet. And those standards vary by country. But in Singapore, the Computer Misuse Act, Hong Kong has a CAP 200 crimes ordinance. The US has the slightly outdated, but it's going through some iterations, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, as well as the Information and Technology Act. And the Philippines has the Crime Prevention Act of 2012. What you'll find in many countries is that defining what is legal and illegal behavior comes down to identifying what is the intent or the motive of the individual's actions. So if the individual's actions show an intent to be dishonest or to deceive or to misuse the system for purposes that it's not meant to be used for, there's typically some outcome that it needs to be weighed against in order to be deemed illegal or to be weighed on the level of some sort of criminal activity. So you would have to prove that either a certain amount of damage was done, that that individual was acting with malicious intent, or just in general that this cybercrime has caused any sort of impact to the regular operations of things. So this sounds very vague, but it can actually be very specific. So knowing the rules, reading them, becoming familiar with them is certainly one way to sort of set yourself up and set your students up to be more vigilant and understand what the boundaries are that they should follow. Another concern that was raised beyond just the legal aspects are that there are background checks. So, how can I feel comfortable going to a job interview when they might see that I was researching, eternal blue vulnerabilities or playing with the DMV, the vulnerable web app online and learning how to hack on my free time? Well, some might admire that as, educational curiosity and encourage that kind of behavior. But it does also sound like others are skeptical that this could come up on a background check and that this could wind up being something that's seen as a negative mark. So again, in places where information is readily available about your background, about your history, about perhaps your browsing activity, it is important to also be able to defend your character in those cases. So to this end, I would suggest that, really take a look at your whole picture. Have you been studying information security for a while? Do you genuinely lead a decent life and you're interested in joining the company because you want to contribute to their mission? There are a lot of factors outside of what you choose to pursue academically that would round out this kind of profile. And frankly, a lot of us in the information security community do what we do because we're concerned about bad. We want to, protect, we want to defend, and we want to root out any sort of vulnerability or weakness in an environment to genuinely improve the state of that network. So what I would say on this is also, instead of being found out or something like that, really wrap your head around what it is that makes you unique in your job interview and not worry so much about your browsing behavior, especially if you've kind of clarified that everything you've done in an academic sense has not violated any laws. I think in general, this is not something to be as concerned about and could hold back a lot of really fantastic talent from pursuing information security. So on this, what are the do's and don'ts? Because that's really the outcome of this talk. So do learn the laws of your country, spend time researching and reading what it is that you should be aware of. Read some case studies, and I'm presenting some now, of people that did not necessarily observe or abide by the rules. And then the number one rule in ethical hacking, and you'll hear this in any training, is that you really do always want to obtain authority and clarify the scope before getting into any sort of ethical hacking engagement. And obtaining authority can also be very important if you're just learning for the first time. Say you're trying to test your skills in Kali Linux and you download a virtual machine from OWASP or SANS and you want to practice in a private range. That is typically permissible, and again, you'll be given some consents to probably sign before you download a lot of these vulnerable applications. I highly recommend you always research, and make sure that what you're doing is safe. I personally have accidentally escaped a sandbox on a campus network and was thoroughly embarrassed and very apologetic and was banned from the network for a month because I didn't read through all of the best practices for protecting that VM and not putting my network adapter in bridge mode. So always obtain authority, clarify the scope, but also really read and understand what it is that you're experimenting with prior to jumping in and embarking on some of these. And also if you obtain some great skills in your OWASP or your CEH or your OSCP training, don't try to apply them somewhere that you have no authority. So don't look down the street and say that that looks like a network that could resemble what you trained on in class, it's very important that you always have clear boundaries as to what you are and are not allowed to do, and you have consent of whatever network it is that you're attempting to learn and train on. The do nots are: do not assume that what you're doing is legal. Do not export or obtain sensitive information needlessly, and that really is the clause that runs common and similar to most of these legal frameworks, is that if there is some intent or if there's some type of fraud or intent to defraud, that is really what makes this a criminal activity. And do not misuse computer resources to negatively impact systems. So unfortunately, many of the denial of service attacks we hear about, where it's a script kiddie who downloaded low orbit ion cannon or some other tool to just fire an attack and actually take down, significant number of websites. All of that could have been avoided by just a little bit more edification and clarification around what should and should not be targeted. And again, learn the laws and obtain authority, clarify scope before embarking on one of these. So then moving on, in a surveillance state, this student said that he was concerned that only legal careers that would be available to him would be cybersecurity careers where he would have to join the state. So this moves into that next reason I see as to why students aren't choosing to pursue cybersecurity, is that they think that their options are limited. Well, that's not necessarily the case. And I will say that because, having worked in fields, including, government contracting, but also, private sector, there are options at each bank, at each insurance company, at each major tech company, at each interesting new startup, at each data science company, to do this kind of ethical hacking and to do this kind of interesting security research that doesn't necessitate your joining a police force or some sort of public sector field of employment. So on that, his concern was that he would be implementing and reinforcing the surveillance by joining that type of career. This is not to say that surveillance will wane or change depending on your type of career, but there are certainly opportunities to work in security in private sector and not have to be part of that public sector. But let's discuss a case study that might shed a bit more light on this as well. There was an Australian researcher who was curious, and he noticed, and again, curiosity is fantastic in this field, but he noticed a very common ID in his bank's URL on the statement page. So what he did was he sort of tweaked that ID and found that he could download financial statements from other individuals as well. So, that being said, could he have stopped at extracting one or two or three of these IDs and extracting only a few financial records? Yes. He then extracted about 500, and that's where you need to know the scope of what you're testing and what is appropriate to prove what you need in order to report a security vulnerability. So he sent those statements, all of them, to the bank directly, which is not only violating what he had authority to do, but also the fact that he was sharing and disseminating that information without the consent of the individual whose financial statement it was. So bringing this back to intent, scope, and authority, this is a case study whereby that individual was not authorized to access these. He was not in a position to be exporting or removing that data. And instead of just demonstrating the security flaw in that common ID that he was able to manipulate, they then wanted to take legal action against this security researcher. So what does this teach you about, gaining these hacker skills and then how to and not to apply them? Again, repeating that you should not go beyond the reasonable bounds to obtain proof. Do not publish on impulse. Do not try to just send these records over because you could get them. There's a great deal of honesty involved in this work where you want to report this vulnerability. Of course, you want to get it fixed, but you should work with the process. So act with integrity, not with pride. And some companies will try to find ways to avoid paying you. It's very encouraging to hear that, and I'll talk about this later, that bug bounty programs do pay out so well and so richly. But it's extremely important that you not overstep your bounds to obtain proof. Here's another interesting case study of what to do and what not to do. And some of you might be familiar with this, but an attendee, a researcher from Tencent, wound up being arrested by the security bureau for invading the hotel's Wi-Fi system. So he had gone to a conference and had also learned some skills about hacking systems at this hospitality institute, and eventually posted that information not just in a discreet disclosure to the hotel, but also publicly on his blog post. And he had published credentials and other pieces of information that could have actually been used to cause great harm. And although he himself did not carry out any subsequent activities, there's that fine line between intent and actions. So the Singapore Cybersecurity Authority flagged him and pressed charges. He was almost sent to prison, but was able to state the case that he was doing this for good reasons, and he walked away with a fine. So again, what not to do not go beyond the reasonable bounds to obtain proof. So if he knew that he could get into these systems, he could have reported that discreetly to the hotel. He didn't really need to publish anything on impulse. He needed to work with this process. He needed to act with integrity, not pride. And no one was going to pay him at that point. He absolutely was going to be fined. And I thought this was interesting. This came from the researcher that gave me a lead on this story. The company did everything that they should not do, which was become defensive and take legal action against the security researcher. So in all of these stories, there's someone at fault, and then there's someone who could be more at fault. So the research firm, or the security researcher, was able to present findings and give a very compelling argument as to why things should be fixed. The company has the onus of accepting that information and trying to fix the problems. And it does reinforce that fear when a company tries to take legal action because you've discovered a vulnerability. So it's a delicate line needing to balance what you should be doing, how you should be doing it, and then learning from examples like these two, that there is a fine line to draw, and you always want to take the high road in order to do this practically and ethically. Final sort of case study that's interesting that also talks about the operational mode of ethical hacking is one researcher decided to use a fake Gmail account to submit his findings. So when you're going through a bug bounty process, you typically find the vulnerability, you find proof of concept, and you try to obtain some proof of life or evidence that you can actually exploit this vulnerability further, and then you draw a line. Unfortunately, the company flagged his email as extortion because he was using a fake name, a pseudonym, to try to protect his identity out of fear that he would be reprimanded or jailed for this. And then ultimately, when he expressed his grievances, the company finally conceded and decided to pay him, but this could have gone very poorly because if he were assuming a false identity, he could be accused of actually doing this with malicious intent. Why was he trying to conceal who he was in order to carry out this research? So an important lesson here is that you should always use your real name. You should use appropriate channels to communicate vulnerabilities and either directly disclose it to the company or go through a bug bounty program. Because in these cases, you want to be very clear and very above board about who you are and what you're doing. Companies can react very poorly to bug disclosures, and they can see researchers as a threat of sorts. But ultimately, if you're doing this in the best interest of the company, it's best to build trust by showing good intentions and going through common streams and normal swim lanes to communicate that to the company that needs to hear it. So then the last comment on lack of interest, and I mean, this does show that there are researchers out there who are either learning of their own volition or participating in larger bug bounty programs to exercise this interest in ethical hacking, or there are researchers who get curious and poke around a hotel Wi-Fi. There are a lot of ways that this is of interest and that I would encourage students to pursue this. If you just go on Google and look up ethical hacking groups near you, you'll see that honestly, all around the globe, there's a number of wonderful conferences, and I will post these in my notes after of just all of the wonderful groups and meetups that you can pursue ethical hacking at. And these groups teach you everything from the basics of web application security to using Metasploit to setting up CTFs. And I know when I was in Washington, D.C., I was a big part of some great weekend CTFs there. There are B-side conferences all over. There are a lot of opportunities to learn this and get involved. So I think lack of interest is not a reason to be afraid or wary of joining this kind of field. So then, again, with lack of interest or lack of prestige, there was also a common thread that students thought it was too big of a hurdle or too much burden to train up and certify to be an ethical hacker or an information security expert or a forensic investigator. And one student actually wrote that, well, to be a project manager, you only need a PMP, seemingly, just interested in the path of least resistance. I just need this one certification and then I can really climb the ranks in all of these ways. So the reason I will say that this is not the case is that you can come from any background and be excellent in information security. It's really about how you want to pivot your career and where you want to go with it. So even in a surveillance state, even in a country where it's very difficult to feel open and honest about ethical hacking and whatnot, there are still a number of certifications that can help you on this path and a number of reasons why you should try to identify whether you would make a qualified information security expert, ethical hacker, investigator, or otherwise. And I picked this picture of Elon Musk because he's often cited as one of the most creative leaders in the space. But essentially, the term hacker has been thrown around in pop culture and around for a very long time. But it really, to me, means someone who is creative, patient, and has humility in order to pursue some of these security problems to their end. And I think that talent far outweighs and outpaces anything else that you might need. And I like to say, and I think I've heard this from a fellow member of the review board, that defense is cool, but offense is cooler. So again, to mitigate that fear of prestige, we'll now talk about how much these bug bounty programs can pay. And this is a very short bullet point, but I know that some people think that this is kind of an offshoot industry, that it's not as attractive as others. Some students have said, oh, well, I could work at a bank or an insurance. But if PayPal is paying out nearly $2.8 million, Verizon has now paid out over 9.5. The average payout for a bug bounty is about $3,650 US, which if you multiply that, say you were to do this every month for a year, you have a generous base salary. If you were to continue also with ethical hacking work as your day job and then pursue this at night, then you're looking at a decent salary that is competitive with anyone in insurance or financial analysis. And I found that each of those fields make about half of this a year starting out. So again, it's a field that you can really climb and become prestigious in a very short period of time. So again, this is a reason that I don't think people should shy away from pursuing cybersecurity or ethical hacking. I think it's something that should actually encourage them to pursue it. And again, to come back to that skills gap, there's just so much need right now that it's important. So to wrap up with bright outcomes, debunk the myth. Offensive security engineers can work at hundreds of companies and thrive. Every company is hiring right now, and it's important to continue to encourage students to pursue this field. It's safe when done right. The careers are well paid. And I'll say, there are many opportunities to pivot. So any skills you obtain in any field of information security can always be applied to solve other problems. So there are a number of ways to pivot within information security, but also once you get out, you've been able to identify and remediate problems, right? Systemic problems in the computer security of an organization. That's an incredible skill, and it really brings you up to the level of strategic thinking that is admired at many companies. So call to action for the audience is I just suggest, identify mentorship opportunities, try to find those students in your neighborhood, down the block, or at your company that might be interested in information security, and encourage them to go try it because, they might just be held back for reasons that we've discussed in this presentation that aren't right, and they might just not have enough information to make that decision. Request a generous training budget. As always, I know that I personally wouldn't have been able to take a lot of the classes I took or pursue any of these certifications without the help of my wonderful mentors in the field, my bosses, and the budgets that allowed us to go get that training and certification. And then, of course, as a plug, send your interns to Black Hat Asia next year. You really are paying it forward by enabling the next generation of cybersecurity experts. And I'll say that I would not be here without the help of my mentors, and I hope to do the same one day. So thank you. Please stay in touch. Again, my name is Mika, and I will stick around after this presentation to talk with you all.